Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today I have a subscriber interview out of Kansas, a hunter who had a terrifying experience while he was out hunting. Before we get into it, a couple links. As you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon and PayPal are in the description below. The merch is displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They all were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support this channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost you a cent. Click that like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads I put out daily, click that bell icon. And please, folks, leave a comment. Why? Well, because all these things, they really do help this channel to continue to grow and go. And they definitely do matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's get into today's upload, shall we? All right, everybody. Tonight I have a subscriber from Kansas. His name is Daryl. He reached out to me saying, hey, I've got an encounter that I really want to share with you. And I said, hey, I really want to hear it. Daryl, how are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm doing very good. Very good. I pretty much told you pretty much how I run it. I don't. The floor is yours, my friend, so I'd love to hear your encounter. I've talked to you for about 45 minutes and haven't heard it yet, so please share.
Right. Okay, well, basically, I live in Topeka, Kansas. My encounter occurred about 2.5 hours south of here, southeast, not very far from the Missouri border and the Oklahoma border, somewhere around maybe Fort Scott area, near a wildlife reserve. And it was about 1992, I would say early November, late August, early November, because we hadn't had any real snow yet. It was, the leaves had fallen pretty good, but, and frost, but nothing on the ground yet. In fact, the week before I'd went up to set my stand and kind of scout the area out, I'd heard about, from a buddy of mine, and, we anticipated hunting together, but we ended up in different spots, and so I really didn't see him after that. But the morning I arrived, it was just an old dirt road winding back into the, country. And when I pulled up, I had 3 different sections of cornfield that I would have to walk through. Just to kind of give you an idea of how far back in I walked. When I went the week before, it took me about 45 minutes to get back to the tree that I had chosen. But that morning of the hunt, typically I would walk slower, a few steps, stop and pause a few steps. Luckily, the ground was fairly moist, so the leaves, there was hardly any noise going in as far as me making noise. And I thought, well, this is perfect environment. I'm going to be able to get in my stand, without disrupting any of the deer in the area. So it took me about an hour to get back in there. And, I hunted quite a bit, so I was really comfortable and at ease in the woods, and it's nice to stop and kind of take stock of what's around you as you're going in, any kind of changes or anything. And so I was to my right, which was west, would have been this. It was this ridge that, from the level of ground I was on, kicked up at probably a 30-degree angle, and it was probably, I would guess, 45, 50 feet above my head, and then there were cornfields up there too, and along this, at the bottom of this embankment, there was an implement road that hadn't been used in eons. There were a lot of old implement roads that they would use to access these different cornfields, and then over the time, I would guess that equipment becomes so large that they just stopped using that road and different ways to get in and out of the field. But anyway, as I was going through the first cornfield, which was about 40 acres, and then there would be a tree line, a hedgerow tree line, maybe 45 feet deep. And then, it would spill into another cornfield, which is about the same size, maybe a little smaller. I didn't walk around all the cornfields when I was there the week before, because I already pretty much knew where I wanted to go. But they're all in comparison as far as size, width, and shape. But it did kind of bottleneck back towards the back the further I went, and that's why I chose that area, because the deer would naturally form into that bottleneck. And so I then went through a third field, and then I got up to the area where I had chose my tree. It was a large cottonwood, and from the little implement road, it was probably, I would guess, 12 feet wide, maybe 15 in areas, but it was just riddled with these little saplings and some larger trees too that have grown up in this service road because no one had used it, and it was just becoming overgrown. But down the center of this service road was a fairly well-worn game trail, and there were several rubbings and some scrapes along there, and so I knew I was in the right area. And I had picked my spot so the wind was to my advantage, of course. But the tree that I was in was growing out of the side of this, 50-foot embankment, about 15, 20 feet up. So there was a service road, a little bit of a dip, and then you crawl up the embankment. And I had all of my gear, aside from my tree stand I set up the week before, and, all the rungs for climbing up in the tree, and, it made a little nest up there. And it was probably 12 feet off of the ground, up the tree. So by the time I crawled on my hands and knees to get up this embankment with my gear and try to be quiet, and, so I was moving slow. Eventually I got up into my nest, and to kind of give a picture of what it was like, the tree was very large, and it had three primary branches that went, to my left, and then to my right, and then one behind me that actually grew up towards the embankment, towards the top shelf behind me, and that cornfield was behind me. So I had a really primo spot as far as where these deer were working through that area, and I lots of terrific sign, everything that I needed for a successful hunt that morning. I was really excited about, this particular buck I'd glassed the week before, and was hoping to maybe get a shot at that. But I didn't really notice until I got up in the tree stand. The environment was, well lit to get there. I didn't have to use my lamp at all, and because it wasn't a full moon, but it was bright enough that it was really pleasant. You could see a fair distance, with that type of light. And guys that deer hunt, they'll know what I'm talking about. But at any rate, I got my bow. I'd knocked an arrow on my whisker biscuit, and I had my bow hanging there. And I was just kind of settling in. And then I realized that Walt Disney wasn't happening. And I always called it Walt Disney because you sit there long enough and eventually you watch the world come awake. You'll see different critters, move around. Anything from birds fluttering up to you and realizing you're sitting there, and then they take off. But I had kind of a ghillie suit on that I had made. And so, I wasn't anticipating any of that activity because I was blending in with my environment really well. I'd prepared. I even brought a skunk in and threw it at the bottom of the tree just to give off some off scent in case just for backup, basically, I guess. I started doing that years before that. But anyway, I noticed that it was just pitch quiet. I mean, quieter than I'd ever experienced. It was almost loud because it was so quiet, if that makes any sense. And I didn't really know how to describe it because it never happened to me before. Usually there's some sort of noise, some sort of white noise, or, leaves rustling from a squirrel or a rabbit or something that you would expect, like a raccoon digging out a stump or something like that. And none of that was going on. Walt Disney wasn't occurring. There had been times when I'd see a skunk come out of a log and it'd sniff around, go back in, then head out, and then it'd have munchkins following it, out into the world. And that's what I called Walt Disney, because the films from back when I was a kid. And so, anyway, it was, I don't know, maybe a couple minutes later when to my right, I caught movement, and I have a little bit of an effect with my eyes. It's a type of night blindness where the cones in your eyes are a little bit rounded off. So until something really comes into an area, it looks like just a dark figure to a degree directly in front of me, but my peripherals are very sharp. So I caught it in my right peripheral, and it was moving along the game trail in my direction, and it was very large, very dark, and it was not, it was just kind of a mass moving towards me, and it was kind of weaving in and out of the saplings, not making any noise. And it was crawling on all fours. It was walking with an unusual gait, but it was moving purposeful, like it had. I first thought it was maybe a bear, and I thought, well, that but I'm in Kansas, and then I thought, well, I'm near Missouri. Arkansas is not that far away. The critters can't tell where a state line is, so I was justifying that, maybe it followed a tributary or just was following game, who knows, and came this far. And because I was in an area where it was fairly thick, I was on private land, but it butted up to some other land. I think it might have been part of government reserve land. I'm not really sure. But the property that I was on was private, and it was fairly thick back in there. And I didn't know for sure how far back in it went, but just by the look of it, it seemed as though it just went on for miles. But everything's sectioned off in that area over there, so it could have been, 2 or 3 miles maybe. But that's quite a bit of space for, something to hide if that's what it decides to do. So anyway, I've got my eye on it, and I'm thinking, well, my hunt's pretty well shot when these deer, get wind of this bear or what come along. And then I notice its head is kind of lumbering. it's going side to side, like it's, sniffing the air. And the wind was set up to where it was downwind of me. And I was in my spot on purpose because I knew where the wind was coming from, because I wanted those deer to come out of that bedding and in that corn and come out in front of me for my shot. So with the way it was moving its head, I could tell it was testing the air. It would go left and right, and it was kind of had this rocking kind of, following. And then I realized, well, I wonder if it's zeroing in on me. Even though I had used scent blocker, I take my clothes and I put them in a bag with cedar branches for weeks on end, and I use different types of soaps that have no scent, that you're basically just scrubbing your skin off your body in preparation for the hunt. And even with a skunk at the bottom of my tree, this thing was coming towards me, I realized. And then it moved into a little bit more of an open area where the saplings had ended, and it was just a dirt road, and that was my kill spot. That was the spot that I had taped off and I had measured, and he was between 30 and 35 yards from me. And he was looking left then right, and every time he looked left, I noticed that his eyes had a red hue to them. And I was thinking, well, I've never ever heard of that. I couldn't understand what I was looking at because I'd never heard of a Dogman before. At that time, I'd heard of, Bigfoot, of course, and I've seen the Patterson film, and this was just not that. I realized that I'm not looking at a bear, but at the same time, my mind was trying to justify the shape. It was trying to, understand what I'm seeing. And so it lets out this guttural growl. And I don't know. I'm calling it a growl, but it had such a low frequency that it shook my guts. Sitting that far up in the tree, it's like it emanated omni range from itself. It hit everything, so it included me. It encompassed me, and I didn't know what to do with my. All this is going on. I'd been watching it coming up, and this effect it had on me, I felt, I don't know if it would be nauseated, but this low frequency shook me like I've never experienced since then. It doesn't matter if you're at an intersection, you have these low, cars, with the low frequency. It was a ULF, an ultra low frequency that I've never encountered since. But I have heard on your show other people describe that, and I'm going, yes, that they get it. Those folks get it. And, I wish everyone could understand what that feels like without having to be in the presence of one of these critters. That I would never wish that on anybody, even people that I may dislike for one reason or another. I would never want to put them in that type of environment. And when it let out that growl, and then it took maybe 3 more steps, right hand, left hand, right hand, and then it just kind of it raised up in the middle of that road, and it took a big whiff to the right and just kind of went and looked right at me, like it sampled the air higher up and then just went boom right at my chest. And I was like, oh man, I'm in big trouble. even now, my hands are shaking, because to relive that, I mean, it's indescribable to people to realize, to be in the presence of a predator like that, that I'm still trying to figure out what it is. I had no idea what to do with myself or the situation. And when its red eyes were looking at me, it kind of tilted its head to the right and then straightened back up. And its size was absolutely massive. It took up the road, and it didn't stay when it came up, when it was sniffing above itself. That was the most erect it would have been, because then it came down into a kind of a natural hunched over state, and its arms were very long. It was in a shadow, even though, and I think it was on purpose. I think these things know exactly where they're at and where the shadows lie all the time, just inherently, naturally. They live it, so they just know where to be all the time to have the best advantage over everything around them. And so when it stood up, it was actually in a shadow. So its eyes were very specific, but I could still see it, just not as well when it passed through the light on those last couple of steps and then stood up in the shadow of the foliage that was blocking the moonlight from getting to it. And when it looked straight at me, I didn't know what to think. And the next thing it does is it takes 2 steps. It lifts its right leg, steps into the divot that would be the edge of the road, and then steps up the embankment behind a tree. And it covered an incredible amount of space. And it was very quiet. Other than the growl, it made no other sound. I don't know, and I'm sure, given the emotional state I was in at the time, I couldn't hear leaves crunching or anything, but it was wet. So it was an environment that would be beneficial to that animal as well. When it stood up behind the tree, it stood half behind the tree. So its left eye, the side of its head, and part of its, like the lats part of its body was behind the tree. And it was absolutely massive. The shoulders on this thing had to have been 3 feet, if an inch. If I had to guess the weight of it, 400 or 500 pounds. Huge critter. Very purposefully agile. Everything it did had a reason. And it didn't shuffle around. It came, the way it crawled up was very purposeful. It was very sleek.
Daryl, not to cut you off, but just 2 questions really quick. Did it have the ears? Did it have tufts on its ears? And was there a visible tail?
It did have tufts, and it did have a tail. And what really brought me out of my whole what in the hell is this thing is when it was behind the tree, it put its hand up on the branch. So there's this tree, and it was a big enough tree that it was able to hide half of itself, its right side, its left side, and its left leg were visible to me, and the left side of its face, like from, I could see most of its muzzle and its left eye and its left ear, which did, it came up off the top of its head. And this critter was almost completely black, other than it favored kind of a gray sheen to it. So when the light hit it just right, it seemed as though its hair was designed to just meld in, like really good camouflage. Like if you had to decide whether you saw something in a shadow or not, you could convince yourself very easily that it actually wasn't there. And but other than that, it was just pretty much all black. It didn't have really long hair. Now, by its head and around onto its shoulders, it had a little bit longer hair. And when it was looking at me, and it put its hand up, and it wrapped its hand around this limb that was also going up the embankment. It was growing in that direction. And when it wrapped its fingers around this limb, like it was just resting it there. And then it looked at me, and its left ear twitched like my dog's ear does. And that twitch brought it home to me, like, holy cow, this thing is real. It's really real. Because I'm not imagining this thing at all, because that it was like a fly type of, or a gnat bothering it, and it just flicked. And its head was enormous. This thing was just, I can't describe how big it was. And the definition to every part of its body was just, incredibly strong. It was muscle bound, but it wasn't overly large like you would imagine maybe a Bigfoot would be. It was just cut. I've heard people talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger and things like that, and it definitely fell within the realm of that, but in its own way. And so I decided that I needed to see more, around the back side of it. So in the branches that I was sitting in, the cottonwood that I was sitting in, these limbs were massive. I couldn't get my arms around them. When I was tying my safety harnesses on, I had to flick it around and catch the other side. That's how big these things were. And so this was a huge cottonwood. And so I slowly leaned to my right, and I leaned clear over and looked past this branch to be able to see the back side as much of this critter as I could. And that's when I saw its tail, and it came up at kind of an arc upwards, and it had a little bit of hair on it. And it was maybe a foot long, something like a foot and a half long. It wasn't like an elongated dog canine tail. It was there, but it wasn't, as long as some of the ones that I've heard about since, discovering your show. And the legs were very thick on the thigh, but reduced as it went down. And then the hock, or that was very pronounced. It was not a man leg. It was definitely canine. It definitely had genitalia. That I noticed when it first stood up and faced me and took the step over, so it was definitely a male. And let's see. So the interesting thing is when I leaned right, so I'm going real slow, and I've got my ghillie suit on and everything, so I'm trying to think that I'm a bush that's, moving real slow like you would when you're hunting anyway. But who am I kidding, right? This thing, it got me no matter what. And so I lean right, and I'm looking at it, and then I start moving back slow. So it was kind of the count of three, like 1001, 1002, 1003. I'm looking at it, and I'm taking that in, and then I go back, and I go about the same. So it took about 3 seconds to get back to a sitting position to where I would then visually engage it again. And during that 3 seconds or so, when I moved from my right to my left, it was gone. It wasn't there. At that point, I was freaking out. I didn't hear anything. These things are so good at moving through brush. They just know where to go. It's obvious. There are times when they want to make their presence known, and they'll move bushes and they'll scratch around, they'll growl, they'll make all sorts of noises. But this thing was very purposeful, and at that time my senses were just going crazy. I thought about shooting it with my compound, and I decided not to because I thought all I'm going to do is piss this thing off. You talk about hunting pigs in the side plate on a pig. If you don't hit it right, you're just going to irritate the pig. And to think of how this thing must have been built wisely, I decided not to shoot it, and I'm glad I chose not to, because I don't think I'd be sitting here today speaking about this at all.
Right.
The only other option was my skinning knife, and I pulled it out of my sheath, and I'm standing there. I feel like a mouse with an eagle coming down on it, and this is my last form of defense. And so I'm standing there waiting for this thing to come up behind me, come up the tree, something. And there's nothing at all. Nothing. And I'm my everything is, this whole thing is in slow motion. A lot of it's just, I don't know if it's because of the way people's heart picks up or it slows down. But everything, a lot of this seemed like it was just like a boo, like slow motion. And then I'd come out of it, and then it'd go boo again, and then come out of it again. And so when I'm standing there with this knife in my hand, waiting basically to die, because I know that all I'm going to do is just stab it a few times if I'm lucky, and I'm gone. On this thing, its fingers were like cigars. They were huge. When it wrapped its hand around the branch, it just kind of it was the confidence it had when it wrapped around it. It was like, it seemed as though it was nonchalant, like I'm just completely relaxed and looking at my next meal, basically, is what his attitude was. But his mouth opened, but he didn't have the grin. That's one thing a lot of people spoke about. They have this grimace, like, I've got you, you don't have a choice, give up now, that kind of a thing. That didn't occur, but I definitely recognized his teeth, like his jowl relaxed, but not in an overtly open position. And that's when he stepped up behind the trees, when I noticed that I could see that part. And he had not a really, really long muzzle, and it wasn't super short. It was somewhere in between. He looked very much like maybe between a German Shepherd and I'm trying to think of the name of the dog that they have curled tails. They're pretty large, gray and white. But anyway, it was kind of a mixture, just because its head was so wide. It had kind of a German Shepherd-esque kind of look to it, but it was rounder like this other breed of dog, and that's why I'm describing the two of them, to give kind of a medium description of what it was. And its eyes were very pronounced. It almost seemed like they were mesmerizing. It was I had to kind of blink and look at other parts of it to get away from the attractant that its eyes created. And I can see where that would be a very successful way to allure people, to put them in such a state of fear that they have no choice but to succumb to their advance and then just rip you to shreds, I suppose. At any rate, I didn't hear anything. I didn't know where it was. And then I smelled it. All of this had occurred, and I didn't smell it at all. And that, and it's because the wind was coming from my left to my right. It was downwind. And it obviously picked up my scent. So its sense of smell was way more than a deer, obviously. It was, high predator, type of level. I probably stunk like a typical human, but I think it might have been curious because I had this ghillie suit on, and it might have been kind of trying to figure me out, kind of a thing. Well, it smells like a stinking human, but it doesn't look like a stinking human. What is that thing up in the tree, And that came to me years later as I, trying to work out and rationalize in my mind, why am I alive? Why am I so special? What occurred? And early on, I used to think because, it knew I was a good old boy, I'm a badass, blah, blah, blah. But that all wore off fairly quick. It knew, there's no way that would even be a possibility, considering even the condition I was in physically, I wouldn't have been, but a millisecond worth of effort on this critter. It passed by me up the embankment. So as I was looking from the right, leaning to the left, I then later found out that it had passed by me. It ran up the embankment 50 feet. It went there from where it was at to the top in 3 seconds. So as I was, so it knew, it was intelligent, and it knew, well, he leaned to the right. So as he's leaning back to the left, I'm going to make my move. And it just did it. It went up to the top, and it wasn't until it went along that ridge up above me in the cornfield and got upwind of me to where I was now downwind that I smelled it. And when that hit me, that barrage of stink, I nearly threw up. It was just putrid. It had a wet dog kind of smell, but there was way more on top of it. And I didn't really, I don't know, there was really kind of a garbage smell, but it was just nasty. I mean, I've been in the presence of people who had passed on and, had been in the a warm environment, and it had kind of that kind of a smell that I could recognize that, but there was more to it. And I almost wonder, and I've thought about this since then, that I wonder if they have the ability to emit some sort of a cover smell, a spray, or something, like a buck deer. They have the scent glands on their body, and I'm wondering if this kind of critter or one of the types has this ability to emit something that is, also like a defense mechanism of some sort, maybe, or just to recognize its presence around other like critters, maybe Bigfoot or werewolf or whatever. I don't know, but it was gut-wrenching smell.
Daryl,
and
not to cut you off again, but we're coming up on about 8 minutes left of record time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
nope,
okay. So anyway, it continued on that ridge towards my truck. So that means I now have to get out of my tree and go back to my vehicle in the same direction it was in. And so I stayed in that tree. I got to my tree about 4 o'clock in the morning. And this encounter happened it was maybe 5-6 minutes. All of this occurred. in that amount of time. And then I stayed in that tree till noon that day. I did not leave that tree till the sun was directly above me. And that's when I decided, okay, I'm getting out of here. And I crawled out of the tree. I went down the embankment, and I was getting ready. I took a step towards my truck, and I realized I got to go look at the prints. I couldn't leave without seeing it. So I walked over, and I saw where it stood up and where its right foot twisted and took a step, and I could see the print down in the gully where, like the edge, like what would be like a curb to a road. And it stepped in there and then stepped up behind that tree. And I had to crawl on my hands and knees to get up to where it stepped. The second step, I had to, help myself up there to get to it. And I was in good shape back then. And then I reached up to try to put my hand on the branch that it just nonchalantly wrapped its fingers around, and I jumped as hard as I could, and I could not swat the bottom of that branch. I was 4 or 5 inches away from it. And that's when I started getting the idea of how tall this thing was. Now, I can jump up and I can swipe an 8-foot ceiling. No big deal. Okay, I could jump up and put my palm print on it, easy. So if I can't jump and touch the bottom of the branch, then that means it's close to 9 feet. And its head was above the branch where it rested its hand. So if the branch is close to 9 feet and its head is above that, you can see its collarbone. That means that critter's got to be 9.5 foot tall. And that's when I really started, the second wave of freaking out hit me, and I just bolted. I went down, I tried to get stay in open areas as much as I could. Everywhere I looked, I anticipated. And I left my equipment in the stand. I left the stand. I left my bow. I left everything. All I had in my hand was my knife. And I ran as fast as I could out of there and to my truck, anticipating this thing to jump out and snap my neck all the way back to the truck. I got in the truck and I wheeled out of there down the middle of these roads, and I stayed in the center of the road all the way back till I got the blacktop, because I wasn't going to chance that if I got up to the edge of the road as tight as the foliage was in the trees, that it could jump out and, snag my little Toyota truck and push it off the road or what have you. This thing was huge. At any rate, that's my account. Since then, I've just recently, we had prints outside the house here 2 months ago, and my son and my wife saw it. And this the pad with the heel mark. It's the exact same kind of print I saw there that day. Only this one was twice as big. The one outside our house had to have been maybe 6-7 feet at the most, I would guess. It was a young one or a different breed. But that's another situation, another story. But anyway, that about covers it.
That's definitely a terrifying encounter, and I sympathize, or I can see exactly why you stayed in your tree stand till noon. I mean, to be honest with you, I probably would have stayed there a little longer. That's just, this thing is huge. Just the way you describe it when you were, like you said, 8 feet, you can swat an 8-foot ceiling. 9.5 feet is a giant. I mean, God, the average height of a male is what, 5'11", 6 foot tops.
Yeah.
That's
I'm 5'9.5", 5'10".
Yeah, and that's just huge. I mean, just imagine the damage this thing could do.
Yeah.
And it's just designed to be the apex predator of the woods is the only thing I can think these creatures were designed for. You know, they're like a shark. They're like a land shark, you know, like, and you know, no reference to John Belushi on that. So, you know, I mean, I'm glad that you were able to share the encounter with us. I'm glad that you got out of that situation okay. And, you know, like most people that have these encounters, you now want to know more about these things. And, you know, it just goes to show that the more questions we ask, the more questions are in front of us. I don't think we'll ever, to be honest, I really don't think we'll ever have all of the answers, unfortunately, unless we have one of these creatures on a slab that, you know, I mean, not government slab, but public slab where, you know, there is an autopsy done and it is broken down for the populace to know, hey, this creature is capable of. And, you know, it'd have to be a full documentary on, like, the Discovery Channel, you know, or Animal Planet. So
sure.
It's just...
Well, and it would have to be, you know, approached by people with doctorates in the right background, so that way they would be credible. People would take them seriously. You know, it took me a long time for me to just stop caring what other people think, because I had to do it for my own peace of mind, my own health, and be damned what other people think. And all I can say is just hope that you never have to experience anything like that.
Yeah.
And it was a very humbling experience. You know, I was, you know, and I'm still a person that, you know, I'm not afraid to deal with human beings. I'm not afraid to manage other people. But something of this, you know, I've been around mountain lions, you know, cougars. I've not been around a bear. I thought it was a bear. I wish it would have been a bear, honestly. But there you go. It is what it is, and I feel fortunate to have had the experience. I feel like I'm one of few on the planet compared to the populace. But I think there's going to come a time when there are going to be way, way, way more people finding out about these things, and then it's going to just, you know, be there. It's going to explode out onto the populace, and people will have no choice but to recognize the value of what it is.
Absolutely. Daryl, we are almost like 30 seconds, 45 seconds before we're out of time. Is there anything that you'd like to say to the Dogman family here?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed everybody's interactions. I've learned a lot. I don't know if I should, but, you know, I want to bring up the fact that I learned a lot of truth just from what I know from Victor and what he has shared, and I completely understand his situation. I hope that everyone else takes some time out to consider that value. Other than that, I want to thank everybody that's put everything forward and all your hard work. And I know you deal with a lot, and I feel you're very professional. So that's what brought me on this show, is that helped my confidence with being able to gain acceptance into this environment with what we're all dealing with in one way or another.
I appreciate that. It's been an honest pleasure having you on the show, and thank you once again.
All right. Be well, y'all.
Have a great night.
You too. Bye.
All right, guys, what an amazing interview. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. Guys, I'd like to thank you all for supporting this channel. Your support is truly what makes this channel special. With that being said, everyone, please stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant. Keeping an eye on your pets, your children, your loved ones, your friends, These creatures are out there. We know they're real. About the best thing we can do to keep the ones that we value safe is to share the information we share with each other on a daily basis. And what they do with that info is on them, but at least we shared it, right? All right, guys. Thank you, and God bless you all.